Are you suffering with a bulging disc and you're hoping to get back into the gym without aggravating the problem? Well, if you are, then this video has all the answers you need for what exercises to avoid and what to do instead. Hi everybody, my name is Will Harlow and I'm the Over-Fifties and Sciatica Specialist Physio here at HT Physio in Farnham. And today I'm going to be talking to you about what exercises in the gym you should avoid when you've got bulging discs and what exercises to do instead. Now, before we dive into the content of the video, if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because then you'll be the first to hear about our new bulging disc and sciatica videos as soon as they come out. Now that that's been said, let's talk about bulging discs, what they are, what exercises in the gym are appropriate, and what you should definitely avoid. So a bulging disc is an injury that in the lower back, when we're talking about it in this context, and in your spine, you obviously got the bones, which are the vertebra here, and in between each one of the vertebra, you've got a disc. And when we're talking about a bulging disc, what we're talking about is the inner material of the disc, which is like a fluid center, starting to push towards the back of the disc. And if you're unlucky, this can touch a nerve. Now, if it touches a nerve, this can result in a whole host of symptoms, including back pain, sciatica, which is pain going down the back of the leg, weakness in the leg, numbness in the leg, and pins and needles as well. So it's a really unpleasant injury. It's something we see all the time. It's the biggest cause of sciatica in the world, is a bulging disc. And quite often bulging discs can affect people in their 30s and upwards. So a lot of the people who get bulging discs tend to be very active. They tend to like exercise. They want to get back into the gym, but they find that every time they exercise, it aggravates it. Now, there's two things you need to realize about bulging discs. The first one is that it's actually very good to be exercising when you have one. The worst thing you could possibly do is to just take bed rest. So we used to recommend in the 1980s that everyone with a bulging disc go and rest for 6 weeks. Now we realize that that was stupid, and in fact it made people worse. So now what we tell people to do is exercise, but do so in a way that doesn't hurt. But the second thing, and this is where the problem is that quite often the exercise at the time feels okay, but then when you finish, it makes the bulging disc worse and it aggravates the sciatica. So it can be very difficult to choose the right exercises to maintain your fitness and help recovery, whilst avoiding the ones that cause more pain and delay recovery, because it's often not obvious. Now, the first thing I'm going to say to you is that the right exercises for a bulging disc will be different for everyone. So I can tell you the ones that work for most people and the ones that are best avoided for most people, but it's going to be slightly different for everyone. So don't just take my word for it. If any of the exercises that I say to avoid actually make you feel good, then it sounds like they might well be the ones for you to continue with. And conversely, if any of the ones I say are usually safe for people make you feel worse, then you should certainly avoid them. So the golden rule when it comes to bulging discs and sciatica, in my point of view, is to avoid any exercise that causes more pain. Now that that's been said, let's actually talk about the most common exercises in the gym that people do that makes the bulging disc worse, so you know which ones to avoid. So I've got 7 common resistance exercises, so gym exercises that people do that make bulging discs worse. So I'm going to go through them one by one and then we'll talk about alternatives. So the first exercise to avoid when you've got bulging discs in the gym is the deadlift. Now, this is probably the most obvious one because a deadlift is actually an exercise that many people sustain their disc injury in the first place. And a deadlift is basically when you've got the barbell on the floor with the weights on it, and you bend down and you pick the weight up just to a standing position, and then you put the weight back down again. Now, the deadlift is a great exercise for strength. It helps to strengthen the back and the legs and the buttocks, and it is a really good overall exercise for health. But when you have a bulging disc, because the deadlift involves flexion, so bending forward, what it ends up doing is putting pressure on the front of a disc. And if you put pressure on the front of a disc, you can sometimes cause the bulge to get worse. Now, if your deadlifting technique is perfect, so you keep a straight back and you lift, theoretically, it should be okay. But for many people, it's still not okay. And the reason is because we're not just bending forward with a straight back, we're now picking up a heavy load from the floor as well. So the whole spine is being compressed now that we're trying to pick up that heavy load. And that can be enough to aggravate a bulging disc, even if your technique is spot on. So now what I say to most of my clients is if you have a bulging disc with active symptoms, so with sciatica or with terrible back pain from it, just avoid deadlifts until the symptoms get better. Now, the second exercise I usually tell people to avoid in the gym if they have a bulging disc is the squat. Now, again, a squat is a fantastic exercise, and for most people, a squat is a great thing to do as long as they've got a healthy back and healthy knees. But the thing about the squat is it ends up with you putting quite significant weight across your back, which compresses the spine. And if you go too deep into a squat, what tends to happen is your bum can tuck underneath you, almost like this. So the pelvis rolls underneath. We call that a butt wink. And that can put pressure on the discs in the spine. And again, it can make that bulge come out and get worse, just at the bottom of the squat. Now, many people find that when they squat, their bulging disc feels okay at the time, and then afterwards the pain gets worse. And that's because you get a delayed reaction of the inflammation around that nerve if you've aggravated it at the time. So we usually recommend avoiding a squat, or definitely avoiding a heavy squat, until that bulging disc is better. Now, the third exercise in the gym to avoid when you've got a bulging disc is the leg press. Now, the leg press itself is not too bad for bulging discs if your technique is perfect. And a leg press is a machine where you put your feet on a pad and you push the pad away from you. Now, if you use a lightweight, if you make sure your technique is absolutely perfect, so you're sat perfectly in the chair on the leg press machine, and when your legs come back towards you, your pelvis doesn't slip underneath you, which is the most common mistake people make, it should be safe. But for many people, especially as they start to get tired in their quads and in their glutes, what will happen is the pelvis will just slightly tuck underneath. And even that tiny little tuck is enough to put significant pressure through the discs, because remember, on the leg press, we're pushing quite a lot of weight, and it can make a bulging disc worse. Now, you can add in the fact that I've also had maybe 4 clients since I started my practice here. These are all young men who have injured a disc using the leg press. Now, make of that what you will, but I'm just saying that obviously if there's the potential there to injure the disc in the first place on the leg press, there's probably the potential there to aggravate an existing bulging disc. So for the sake of safety, I usually tell people with a bulging disc to avoid the leg press if they can, because there are other alternatives they can do that seem to be safer when you have a bulging disc. Now, the fourth exercise I recommend people avoid when they've got a bulging disc is the knee extension machine. And the knee extension machine is that machine that you sit on and you push your knees, you push your shins upwards with a pad at the front of the shin, and you straighten your knee to work the quads at the front of the leg. Now, the problem with the knee extension machine is not that it puts too much stress through the spine, but because the chair tends to put you at a right angle and then we're asking you to extend your leg, that looks a lot like a position that we call the slump. And the slump is a position that we use to try and aggravate someone's sciatica in the clinic to test whether they have a bulging disc. So if you're doing knee extension after knee extension after knee extension, your muscles are getting tired, you keep extending your leg, what you're doing is on a low level, you're repeating that slump test over and over and over and over again and adding tension to the sciatic nerve. Now, this is enough to aggravate cases of sciatica. It often makes people come off it and have a numb foot afterwards if they've got a bulging disc, and that's because you're aggravating that sciatic nerve, you're putting tension on it over and over again, and it's not the right thing to be doing at this time. So we usually recommend people avoid the knee extension as well. Now, before I go any further, I understand that what I've done is probably ruled out half of most people's leg workouts. And unfortunately, that's just the way it is with bulging discs. Lots of leg exercises tend to aggravate them But don't worry, if you stick around a little bit longer on this video, I'm going to give you some great alternatives to the exercises we just ruled out. Now, the fifth exercise to avoid when you've got a bulging disc is the bent over row. Now, the bent over row is an exercise that involves a barbell. You bend forward, hinging at the hips, and you pull the weight up towards you like this, and it works the muscles in the back. Now, the bent over row movement itself is fine, but the issue here is the position you're having to stay in order to make the exercise work. And that is a position of flexion. So bending forward, which again is putting pressure on the front of the discs, and add to that, you're weighing something quite heavy off your arms in order to pull it up. It just generates a lot of compressive force through the spine and can make disc bulges temporarily worse. So avoid the bent over row if you can. Now, the next exercise, or the sixth exercise I recommend people avoid when they have this problem, is the dumbbell row. And the dumbbell row is an exercise where you use an exercise bench. You put one knee on the bench, one hand on the bench, one foot on the floor, one arm holds the dumbbell, and you row upwards like this with one arm. And again, the row itself, there's nothing wrong with that exercise at all, but the issue here is the leg that's straight. So if that's the leg that has the sciatica, you have the leg straight, you're bent forward, you're putting pressure through the spine. That looks an awful lot like the slump test yet again. So the leg you're using to support you, if it has sciatica, tends to suffer as a result. So again, there are better exercises for you to do right now if you have a bulging disc than the dumbbell row. So try and avoid that one as well. Now, the seventh exercise I recommend people avoid when they have a bulging disc is the hamstring curl. Now, the hamstring curl is a machine where you sit on it or you lie down on it and you use the pads behind your leg to bend your knee and pull the pads towards your bottom. And that strengthens the hamstrings at the back of the leg. Now, again, strengthening the hamstrings is not an issue, but the issue here is when we extend the pads back away from us using the hamstrings. What happens with people when they get tired is they tend to overextend the legs. And again, they're putting a stretch on the sciatic nerve. So you're starting to spot a theme here. Anything that puts a stretch on the sciatic nerve or puts you forward into flexion of the lumbar spine tends to be exercises to avoid in a gym. So those are the big 7 to avoid. I'm just going to quickly recap them before we go over the ones to do instead. So number 1 is the deadlift. Number 2 is the squat. Number 3 is the leg press. Number 4 is the knee extension machine. Number 5 is the bent over row. Number 6 is the dumbbell row. And number 7 is the hamstring curl. Now let's talk about some that will be better and can be used to replace the ones we've lost. So we'll start with the back exercises because we've lost the bent over row and we've lost the dumbbell row. Well, what you could do instead is you could do a pull-up. So pull-ups are great for 2 reasons. Number 1 is they're very good at strengthening the back and the arms. But number 2 is that when you're hanging, what that tends to do is actually decompress the discs in the spine. Now, hanging's not suitable for everyone, but for some people, especially those who are fit and healthy, they tend to actually find relief when they hang. So why not get some relief from your disc bulge whilst also strengthening your back and your arms? So the hanging pull-up tends to be a good exercise for people who have this issue. They can do wide grip, they can do narrow grip, and either way it will work a different part of the back. Now, if you can't do a pull-up because you're not quite strong enough, then that's fine. What you could do instead is the lat pull down, and that tends to be totally safe for people with this problem. To do a proper lat pull down, you extend at the spine and you pull the bar down towards you on the machine. And again, this doesn't put much pressure through the discs. Your feet are locked in, so you're not having to strain to keep yourself down. And it tends to be a great alternative for back workouts. Now, for the leg workouts, a great exercise to replace the squat is the standing lunge. Now, a standing lunge is a good exercise because you're holding dumbbells rather than having them on your back. So you still get some compressive force of the spine, but it's not quite as bad. You tend to not be able to use quite as much weight when you're doing a lunge, so there's less overall force going through the spine. And with the lunge, you take one foot in front of the other and you do a squat down in a lunged position. So it tends to be a more gentle exercise. You keep your back straight throughout. You don't get this butt wink type thing that people get with squats, your back stays straight throughout. So a lunge tends to be a lot safer for people with this problem. Now, for most people with a bulging disc, exercises like the shoulder press or the military press with dumbbells up overhead tend to be okay, but I'd caution you not to go too heavy. You don't want to extend or overextend too far to get those dumbbells up and put too much pressure through the spine. And then finally, for your upper body, the bench press and the dumbbell press, incline press, they all tend to be pretty safe. They're not putting a huge amount of stress through the spine. So for most people, as long as the bulging disc is more or less settled down enough for them to get in the gym, those exercises tend to be okay as well. Now, a lot of people ask me about cardio and whether or not they should use the treadmill or the bike or the elliptical when they're trying to keep their cardiovascular fitness when they've got a bulging disc. And the answer to this is quite different for everyone. So what I would say is most people with a bulging disc tend to not do so well on the bike. And you can tell if this is going to apply to you because if you sit and your bulging disc or your sciatica feels worse after you've been sitting, it's probably a good idea for you to avoid the bike. Now, the elliptical tends to be pretty good for a bulging disc. It doesn't really aggravate problems. It's probably the best on this list because it's non-impact based, so you're quite gentle, you don't have any impact, and it tends to move the arms and the legs in a way that doesn't aggravate a bulging disc. Treadmill walking tends to be very good for bulging discs, but not everyone can tolerate running on a treadmill. So for most people, I recommend starting with walking on a treadmill or walking outside, or the elliptical, and then only if it feels okay do they try to do a little bit of a run or cycle on a bike. Now, the other thing I'd recommend people avoid when they've got this problem is a rowing machine, because it involves lots of flexion of the spine and lots of tension on the sciatic nerve when that leg extends. So the rowing machine is also something to be avoided. Now, I hope that all makes sense. That's given you some things that should be okay for a bulging disc and other things to avoid. I appreciate there was a lot of information in that video, but if you found it useful, please drop me a comment below and let me know. And if you want more from me, you can feel free to pick up a copy of my book. It's called Thriving Beyond 50, and you can find it on Amazon using the link below this video. We also have a dedicated sciatica website with a link to that in the show notes below. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to speaking to you on the next video.